Pastor, I was watching you during communion. Did you go somewhere? It seemed like all of a sudden you were far away from us. Oh, that probably happened. It happens from time to time, at least for me, in the midst of worship. There are those holy encounters, those moments when it all seems to come together in one holy moment. Perhaps it's that peace that I talked about last week. I don't know. But suddenly there are those times of imminence of God's presence, of insight, of revelation. It may be only for a moment, but it's a grand aha. I had one of those not too long ago. I was worshiping in a small church in northwestern Pennsylvania, leading worship for 8 others, most of whom were much older than I was. I watched them come in. They got out of their cars with not just a little difficulty. It was not an easy walk from the parking lot for many of them, but they had come. These were, as I observed, old people who had seen better days. But there in the midst of worship, they had been transformed. They sang like a congregation of dozens, full of voice, full of life. They had come that morning, not for a family gathering, not for some kind of social time. They had come to worship the God who promised to be with them in the midst of their broken, troubled, confusing, messed up lives. They'd come to see and to hear that God had not left the building. And they articulated that as they left that morning in their farewells and in their words to me. It was pretty incredible to experience. The Lutheran reformers said that the church is the place where the word is preached and the sacraments are administered. And that is enough. Well, there are plenty of things the church can do and probably should do. But what defines us, what we are called to be, is that body gathered around word and sacrament. And it is enough to sustain us, to feed us, to encourage us, to remind us that in the midst of the crazy world we live in, God has not left the building. Whether it's the four walls of a church or wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, God is with us. And oh, how we need to hear and to see that these days. With exterminations in Buffalo, murders in Texas, disasters, war in the Ukraine, death, sickness, an economy gone crazy? Political mayhem? When will it end? It's tempting to believe that God has left the building. That He's left us on our own, and we're screwing up right and left. I had a colleague post yesterday that they had no clue what to preach this morning with everything that had happened this week. I felt sorry for them. Had they forgotten their call? It is pretty clear. We preach the word. We tell the story. And we live that story out. The story that gathers us today in the midst of all that is going on around us is a story that God refuses to leave us. Even when we would just as soon be left alone, God continues to walk with us, accompanying us on this crazy journey from life and death to new life. The story we tell is a story of God's presence. It's a story from the beginning of Adam and Eve when they mess up paradise and get expelled from the garden. God goes with them. He does not leave them alone. He clothes them in their vulnerability and walks with them. When Abraham and Sarah continually take things into their own hands to try to make God's promises real, God continues to bless them. He wrestles with a dirty, rotten scoundrel like Jacob over and over again. When his brothers sell him off into slavery, God goes with Joseph and turns what was meant for evil into good as he feeds the nation. When God's people find themselves in bondage to Pharaoh in Egypt, God breaks their bonds of slavery and leads them through the waters and the wilderness into the promised land. When they continually mess up and fail to listen and end up in exile in Babylon, God goes down to Babylon and eventually brings them home. Again and again, as God's people scatter, like a shepherd, he goes and looks for them and brings them back over and over and over again. It is that story that we tell. It is that story that we so desperately need to hear at times like these. But God goes one step further. He comes to us this day in flesh and blood. He comes in the form of Jesus, the risen Christ, in bread and wine, body and blood, that we may see and feel and taste the very presence of God in our midst, that we may be sustained in the midst of our weariness and have our joy restored. God has gathered us for worship, that we may be sustained, that we may realize that God has not left the building. This is more than just thoughts and prayers, though. This is a gathering that transforms, that gives us hope in the midst of hopelessness, that gives us courage when our knees become weak, that sends us out into the world to be and to do those things that we need to do for the sake of our brothers and sisters. We come to be transformed as well has to be reminded. It is that holy encounter that dares us, that calls us, that blesses us, that feeds us, but then sends us out to be a light to the world and to each other. A reminder in all that we do and say that God is still with us, Emmanuel. That the world and we may know and believe we are not alone, even though the way is dark. Through the night of doubt and sorrow, onward goes the pilgrim band, singing songs of expectation, marching to the promised land. Clear before us through the darkness gleams and burns a guiding light. Pilgrim, clasp the hand of pilgrim, stepping fearless through the night. One the light of God's own presence on the ransomed people shed, chasing far the gloom and terror, brightening all the path we tread. One the object of our journey, one the faith that never tires, one the earnest looking forward, one the hope our God inspires, one the strain that lips of thousands lift from the heart of one. One the conflict, one the peril, one the march in God begun, one the gladness of rejoicing on the far eternal shore, where the one Almighty Father reigns in love forevermore. Onward, therefore, sisters, brothers, onward with the cross our aid. Bear its shame and fight its battle till we rest beneath its shade. Soon shall come the great awakening, soon the rending of the tomb, then the scattering of all shadows, and the end of toil